Today I'm going to talk about the findings of the work that we're doing, and these findings are based on trips that I've taken in the region, the work that I've done in Iran, and the discussions we've had with women from the Middle East and North Africa, some of them from the revolution countries. And I'm going to be talking about some of the common challenges that women face in this region. Now, I find it and I'm going to draw upon examples of both what's going on in some of these countries and my experience in Iran as well. I feel it's critical, and I think I mean, this is obviously a university audience, so I would guess that many of you know this, but I feel a duty upon myself to always mention it, that women in this region have been struggling for their rights for over 100 years. They have gained a lot of their rights. They've gained rights in terms of their education and civil rights, but they've been marginalized politically. Certainly, I think that they're more than being victims. They're certainly not victims, but they're advocates of their own rights, and they're involved in a continuous struggle that they choose to be a part of, and they're involved in fighting for rights that they feel that they fully deserve. I think looking at their struggle for rights should probably also, besides paying attention to women's struggles for their rights, you should look at it in a broader struggle for human rights in the entire region and democracy. And I think that the international community, the Western community, really came face to face with this broader struggle over the last year. So I want to put it in context in that sense. But women in this region have been fighting for their rights for many years, for over 100 years. The women's movement in these countries are over 100 years old. And they managed to gain a lot of rights in terms of their civil rights and their education in the 50s and 60s, but unfortunately were marginalized politically. And later on in the late 80s, mid-80s, early 90s, we saw the emergence of a lot of women's rights organizations in line with international conferences, the Beijing conference, and conferences addressing women's rights. You see the emergence of women's rights organizations working to adopt international law, or to implement international law, or to bring their rights in line with international law. We see a lot of these countries in the region signing on to CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, a UN convention, but with reservations, of course. So a lot of women have been working actively to bring their rights in their own countries in line with international human rights standards. And I should also say that the US is also not a signatory to CEDAW. Many of these countries are. The region has a very young population. Iran, for example, over 70% of the population is under 35 years old. Egypt has a very similar demographic. So things are changing. It's not, even though they're conservative cultures, things are changing because we have a younger population that's connected to the international community. They're connected to satellites, they're connected to the internet, and culture and their demands and their identities are changing very quickly. At the same time, we have an emergence of Islamic movements in these countries, and some of that can be attributed to the undemocratic nature of the governments in these countries. Many of these countries in the region, up till recently, were US and Western allies, but they were some of the worst dictatorships internationally. So it leaves some questions, I think, in that respect. And in countries like Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and the protests in Iran, women were present and on the streets fighting for the revolution right alongside of men. Many Western observers were surprised to see this happen. They were surprised to see that women were out on the streets fighting, getting killed, getting beaten. For me, it wasn't surprising because I'd spent a lot of time in Iran and I'd seen that women are present in social life, and I expected it in Iran and I expected it in other countries. But I think that the world got a different view of this region than it had in the past, and I think people had thought in the past that women in this region were subservient, that they stayed home, that they weren't socially active, but they definitely got a different view. But what's happening now in these countries, now that they've achieved their revolution, they're being told by their male counterparts to go home, that, you know, it's fine, you were out in the street, you supported the revolution, you did your duty, you got killed, we honor the female martyrs, but, you know, you need to go home and you need to tend to your duties as a woman and as a wife. So, but women aren't taking that advice. At least they're not taking it lying down. They're fighting back, and they're trying to maintain the space that that was created for them, or that they created themselves because of these revolutions. These are pictures of women that I took when I was in Egypt this past summer, when Egyptians took to Tahrir Square again. I mean, they've done it several times again since then, to demand that the revolution and the officials in power implement reforms faster, and that this was to move along the elections. Now, like I said, I'm going to be talking about some of the common trends. The contexts in these countries are different. Obviously, the position of women in these countries are different. But there are some trends that emerge when you look at them, when you look at several countries at the same time, that are common among all these countries. And the first one I want to talk about is the issue of religion and culture versus human rights, this discourse that we keep hearing about how women's rights are Western concepts, that they're not Islamic concepts, that they're not Eastern concepts, and that when you talk about women's rights, you know, women in those countries, when they talk about women's rights, they're often accused of promoting a Western agenda, of being supported or sponsored by the West, Western feminists, or trying to import ideas and ideals that are alien to their cultures. Oftentimes, this discrimination based on women is justified while it's rooted in culture and history, and perhaps sometimes in interpretations of religion. It's justified on the basis of very, very conservative interpretations of Sharia law, such as the case in Iran, such as the case that's sort of emerging in countries like Egypt, or even Tunisia by some of the Salafists. I don't know, I'll give you a couple of examples because I think maybe not everybody here would know what that means. That means that women have lesser rights in marriage, that the husband is the head of the household and once they get married. So he has the rights, he makes decisions for the children and for the wife. So when she wants to travel, she has to gain her husband's permission to travel. It's very hard for women to get divorced. Women don't have guardianship of their children. So even if they have custody of their children, they can't make financial decisions or major health decisions for them. This is the case in Iran, and this is some of what's being proposed in many of these other countries, and it's also some of the case in some of the countries that are seen as Western allies as well. I mean, some of them are actually more restrictive when it comes to women's rights. Some of these Western allies, you just don't hear about it as often. Now, what happens is that it's justified based on very conservative interpretations of Sharia law, and how it's justified is that actually women and men are equal in the eyes of God. They're equal, they're seen as equal, but because women and men are accorded different responsibilities, complementary responsibilities, within society and the family, therefore they should be accorded different rights to go in line with their roles. So the man is the head of the household, then his life should be valued more. He should gain more inheritance, things like that. And this concept is often referred to as equity as opposed to equality. So in Iran, we had a kind of a major breakthrough, I think, in the last elections, 2009 elections, when two of the reformist candidates actually talked about supporting the demands of the women's movement, and one of the conservative candidates talked about the concept of equality. He qualified it. He said, in society, that in the family, women should be subservient to their husband or live up to their roles. He didn't say subservient, but to their traditional roles, but in society they should benefit from equality. And this was the first time that a conservative had actually used the term equality. So for us it was significant because this was our discourse, it was our definition and our terms. So But it's, but you'll hear this, and I think that people should be aware of it, because sometimes they'll hear about women's roles being talked about in a very idealistic sense, and they don't understand that it really means that women have lesser rights. So I think it's important that when you talk to people where you hear this, that you ask very specific questions. What does this mean? What are you advocating? Are you advocating polygamy? Does this mean that that women cannot get divorced? Does it mean that they don't have guardianship rights of their children? Does their testimony count as half that of a man in court? So these are critical questions to ask. Unfortunately, these arguments in favor of Sharia, and you hear this a lot of times, we say that these countries, countries of the revolution, are going to be democracies, but they're going to be a little bit different than Western democracies because they're based on Sharia law. So I think that people forget to ask what this actually means. And the argument in favor of this very conservative Sharia law tends to dismiss the progressive work that's being done in these countries by progressive religious scholars. And in countries like Malaysia, Morocco, Iran, Bahrain, for example, the Moroccan Madwana, or Mudawana, it's the family code. And it gives women a lot of the rights in family and their personal status code that they enjoy in Western countries. And it's very much in line, I mean, not 100%, but to a great degree in line with international human rights standards. And it's based on progressive interpretations of Sharia law. But nobody refers to that when they talk about a woman's place, when they talk about Sharia law and cultural considerations. But some of this work is being done, it's actually being applied in countries. Even in Tunisia, with their independence, they gave women equal rights in pretty much all sort of personal status codes. But and that was done, again, based on progressive interpretations of Sharia law. It wasn't done out of context. It wasn't a Western concept. But people don't refer to this when they advocate against women's rights. Now, many of these interpretations and practices are also based on cultural beliefs. For example, in Egypt, FGM is,
Say FGM.
FGM, female genital mutilation, is conducted on about 80% of women. So 80% of the women that you meet in Egypt have been, have undergone some sort of mutilation. And it's justified based on Islam, but there's nothing in Islam that says this. Okay? And so I think that you get a lot of this, where cultural practices are sort of attributed to Islamic belief, and when you have attempts to stop it, then they say that this is your attempt to stop it is not really part of our culture, it's Western, it's imported, so you need to back off. And a lot of times these practices against women are justified and supported based on political considerations, based on the fact that these countries are closed political countries and women's issues tend to be sensitive. So you get, for dictators or political groups that concede to one another on issues that have to do with women. You see clear examples of that, for example, in Afghanistan, where Sharia law was implemented for the Shiite community. And this goes against their constitution. So you see this, and these are political considerations, and women are oftentimes the easiest group to sell out, because they're not politically represented in the same way. They don't have as much political clout. They don't use violence to push their... And I think that there's that a lot of times, even among the Democrats in these countries, that they do adhere to very serious patriarchal beliefs. Another problem with Sharia law or religious law, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's Sharia law or it's Christian law, or is that it's seen as sacred, and so it becomes extremely difficult to change and reform. Every time someone wants to reform it, they're accused of heresy and speaking out against God, speaking out against religion, and they're threatened to death. So it becomes very hard. And I think that observers watching these countries as they write their constitutions, and Western observers, international communities, really need to be careful about the wording, because if people make mistakes, then it becomes if people make mistakes in terms of writing the law. Even if it's not intentional, it becomes extremely difficult to change if it's said that it's Sharia law. In Egypt, the Coptic Christians, that I think you hear about a lot of times, you don't really hear about how conservative and restrictive they are. But it's so difficult for Coptic Christians to get divorced. It's not difficult, it's not allowed. That Coptics actually convert to Islam in order to be able to get divorced. And this creates a lot of conflict and tension in these communities, and that conflict and tension is actually played out on women on issue and in the name of issues of honor. So the violence against, men may also convert to Islam to get divorced, but the violence is always the share of the woman. She is the one that's dealt with violently. The problem is that, especially in these new countries where you have an opportunity to write constitutions that adhere to women's rights, that support women's rights, that the international community is not really being very supportive either. Because when it comes to women's rights, the international community, the UN, the EU, all these bodies, the governments, they say that, well, this is a matter of their culture. We don't want to interfere in their culture, and we don't want to disrespect them. But the international community interferes in cultures of these countries all the time. They do it when they impose, force them to reform their economic situation, when they intervene for human rights or for other security purposes. Sometimes they interfere militarily, but when it comes to women, then nobody wants to interfere. And I think it's important to remember and tell the international community that many of these countries are in fact signatories to international conventions, human rights conventions, and universal law, and that they have an obligation under universal law to uphold that law, that their laws and their practices cannot go very much in contradiction to these international laws. And I think this is something that's often missed by the international community. And it makes you wonder as a women's rights activist when you're told that you're imposing a culture of a different country. And I think it's important to remember that in all of these countries, in the most difficult of places to work, that there are women who are advocating for equality, even when their lives are at stake. So it's critical to say that if these women are actually advocating in these countries under these difficult circumstances, then it must be part of their culture as well. Anyway, I think the other question that, the other issue to keep in mind is that when the international community dismisses claims of women for equality on the basis that it's cultural, it actually emboldens the conservatives. It doesn't appease them. It makes them more aggressive. So the next, if their vision is based on ideology, then it's the next step. So you bargain women's rights, then what do you bargain? Do you bargain the rights of minorities? Do you bargain other issues? And when you talk about Sharia law, I think a lot of times that the international community and people in the groups in these countries, they fail to explain what that means. Does it mean just women's rights? Is it just women's rights in the family, or does it actually mean corporal punishment, the hanging, stoning, the cutting off of hands? So what does it mean? And I think that it's critical to ask people to be very specific when they talk about culture, religion. How does that translate into law? It's critical to do it now because this is the time when people are writing their constitutions. And lastly, I think the international community doesn't push on women's issues because, again, it's a sensitive issue. It's an issue that they bargain away because of security concerns. The same way that they bargain away human rights issues or democracy because of security concerns, they do it for women. And, is a human rights framework Islamic as well? Can it be? I'd like to argue that it is. That it's not mutually exclusive. I don't think that universal rights and Islamic values are mutually exclusive by any means. I think that they have a lot of points of convergence. I think the concept of human dignity is not a Western concept. It's not a non-Islamic concept. It's as much an Eastern concept as it is a Western concept, and it's as much an Islamic concept as it is a secular concept. So I think it's important to really keep this in mind when people say, that universal values are foreign, they're Western, to argue that and say that no, it's not. And actually, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was also written by an Islamic scholar. So it's an important thing to keep in mind when you hear these arguments. Now, I think cultures also need to change. Certainly in many of these countries, there are people who believe, even women who believe that women shouldn't have equal rights. I'll give you this example. I met this woman. I met her in Cairo, and at Tahrir Square, and I asked her why she was out protesting, and she said that she was there to defend the revolution. And I said, what do you think about women's rights? And she said, oh, women have all their rights in Egypt. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, women have the rights. I said, what about polygamy? Men are allowed to practice polygamy. And he said, well, that's the culture, that's Islam, and they should do it, and that's their right, and it's better than having people have relations, legitimate relations outside the law. At least this is legal. Now, this is a woman who was a university professor, or according to her, but clearly she spoke English very well. She seemed like, she had traveled a lot, she was well educated. Here's a young woman I met a couple nights later in Tahrir Square, and she was a secretary, and I asked her what she thought about women's rights, and you can see she was veiled, and she said that she believed that women's rights really was an issue, that Egyptians needed to work on women's rights, and that it was an important issue for her. So you see, I think that some of our stereotypes might be a little bit skewed when it comes to this region, but certainly I think the young people in this region are looking for change, and that they tend to value their own rights and their human rights more than maybe the older generation. And here are a couple of young women, young girls that I met in Tahrir Square as well, and I think it's important for us, as international observers or actors, and also for people in those countries writing constitutions, to really think about how they're going to respond to this younger generation in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years' time, how they're going to defend the laws that they draft today in 30 years' time. Now, the second challenge that faces women in these countries is that women are often told, almost always told, not often, that they should wait for democracy. Before the revolution, as democracy activists, which tend to be the folks that you would expect to be your biggest supporters, women's biggest supporters for, demanding their rights, are often telling women that, your demands are divisive, you're taking away energies from the larger fight for democracy, your issues are sensitive, that if you press on your issues, you risk the possibility of tilting the balance in favor of conservative groups, and you should just abandon your fight for women's rights and come and join the fight for democracy. Once we achieve democracy, then we will achieve women's rights. And unfortunately, that's not usually the case, as we can see. And certainly it hasn't been the case in Egypt and in Tunisia or in Iran, for example. After the revolutions, women's issues become too sensitive again. So people who advocate women's rights and advocated women's rights before the revolution are accused of somehow siding with the dictators, because a lot of these countries that, the dictators use women's rights as a showcase to show that they were making progress. So oftentimes that they're associated with this, and women are, there are reprisals against women. And, if women press for their rights, sometimes then they're told, you're worrying about the right for divorce, or, you're asking for divorce rights or a right to travel, and we have the major task of building a nation at hand. So they're dismissed, they're minimized and belittled. And sometimes women are relegated to only address family law. They're not brought into other issues like security concerns or security sector reform. They said, okay, you can take your little piece of the pie and deal with that, and we're going to deal with the bigger issues. But the reality is that post-revolution doesn't guarantee that women's rights are going to be given to them or be adhered to. And actually, in a lot of these countries like Tunisia and Egypt, despite the fact that space has opened up for the population is that there's actually a backlash against women. Here are Tunisian women fighting for their rights, and this is actually a colleague of ours in Tunisia, and she always says that, we're fighting for our liberties here. And I think Tunisia is a good case in point, because Tunisia's had pretty good laws on the books since the 50s. Now they're being threatened with repression in the law. Even though there's a lot of lip service that's being given to women, they're saying that we're going to change laws to bring them in line with CEDAW, but there are no specifics that are being given. And I think women in these countries are saying that Ghannouchi and Ennahda, the major Islamic party, is being purposefully vague, that they're not talking about what they want to change and how they want to change it. They're just saying that just to keep people quiet and not to stir waters. And today, actually, from this woman in this photo, I got a email, and I'm going to read a little bit of it, and she's saying, "We're going through crucial times. Manuba, the university, is again the target of Salafists. Amal Grami told me her photos were on each classroom so that she will be an easy target for those of them that do not know her. She was asked to stay home today. Amina was at Manuba today. They threatened to slaughter her." So this is some of the violence that's going on, and and actually I think Tunisia is doing pretty well. Women are doing very well. They managed to get a parity law in the elections. They managed to get a lot of women elected, even though they're Islamists, but their liberties and their space are being threatened in ways that they've never ever experienced before. Women are being targeted for their dress. They're being targeted with death threats. Not just women, also other progressive thinkers, human rights activists, but women are among them. And so this is a serious cause for concern, what's happening in these countries. Now, the third challenge facing women is a weak or non-existent civil society. Civil society in these countries tends to be weak generally because they're dictatorships, they're just transitioning to democracy, space for civil society has been closed. So many of the people entering civil society are entering it for the first time. The existing organizations perhaps were limited, pre-revolution. They didn't have that much time. They didn't have that much experience. And, sometimes people identify them as being aligned with the dictators because they could manage to have some little bit of space to work before the revolutions. And there are a lot of younger, newer activists that are coming into it that don't necessarily agree with older activists. For example, in Egypt, there is difference in terms of what people think that, whether it's culture that they should work on or whether it's the law. And older feminists think that they shouldn't lose any of the rights that they've managed to gain. And they've gained very little rights, for example, in terms of divorce rights or age of marriage. And these are even being proposed to be turned back. And so some younger feminists are saying, well, maybe it's okay because our culture, we really have to work on our culture. So there is not agreement in the women's movement. And then also there are issues of conflict within the movements, within civil society, that make it much more difficult to really push forth women's issues in these countries. And this is actually a young woman that I met, Dina. She became active during the 18 days of the revolution. And I went to Tahrir Square with her. And it was amazing because everybody knew her. And this is a guy whose brother was martyred in Tahrir Square. And he lost his teeth in custody. But she's quite an amazing woman, and she became an activist during this period. And she was very idealistic, but she feels frustrated, and she feels because the reality of doing work on women's rights doesn't necessarily coincide with her ideals. And she tells very amazing stories about how she didn't know how to write a memo. She had to go and sit with people all day long when she wanted to have a first meeting. She started a coalition of revolutionary women in Tahrir Square because she saw all these movements that are emerging for youth and for all these other groups, but there was none for women, so she started it. But she had no experience. She didn't even know how to write a memo. So you can imagine. And Libya is even, I think, Egypt does have a strong civil society, but Libya, for example, civil society has been non-existent. So they're struggling with some of these very basic issues. And here's the tent of the coalition, Revolutionary Coalition of Egypt for Women in Tahrir Square. And then also, in terms of a weak civil society, political parties, usually it's the progressive political parties that take up women's issues, but they tend to be a lot weaker than the Islamic parties. So it's very hard for them to push on women's issues. It's very hard for them to get elected. In Tunisia, considerable, I mean, there were so many different political parties, progressive political parties, that failed to establish a coalition, that a large number of the vote was actually dismissed. And even though the Islamist Party won the majority, but it wasn't a solid majority, and it won the majority because so many of these other parties were dismissed, the votes were dismissed. So the political parties have issues as well. And you know, sometimes the progressive parties actually bargain away women's rights and they compromise it. But I think that the important thing is that they have to be told and have to keep in mind that bargaining away the rights of 50% of the population does not lead to democracy. Now, I just want to show you a little something from Egypt. What we talk about women's rights, you know, women's civil society organizations, with all the restrictions they have, the small space that they have, they're doing some really amazing work. And, you know, is this really women's issues? This is the Center for Egyptian Women's Legal Assistance. Now, this is an amazing place that I went to, and I was so touched and just seriously moved by what I saw here. They're providing legal assistance, and she actually works on reinterpreting, you know, providing progressive interpretations of Sharia law. But this is the area, you just take kind of a left turn in Cairo, one of the better neighborhoods in Cairo, and this is where you end up. These people are living in informal settlements. They're half-built buildings. This is, you know, and a lot of things happen. She talked about how the rate of child abuse, sexual abuse is so high here because they don't have their own bathrooms, so they have to use communal bathrooms, and a lot of these children are sexually abused. This family was living in this. This is, I mean, when I saw this, I really understood why the Egyptians had a revolution. Anyway, the fourth challenge that women face is media coverage. They don't have access to media. For decades, national media was not trusted by the population, so nobody paid attention to it, whatever it said. Satellite media became very much sort of a replacement for many of these people who were looking for the news. But a lot of these satellite media are broadcast from countries like Saudi Arabia with extremely regressive messages on women. And when you talk to women's rights activists in these countries, particularly in countries like Tunisia, they say that we don't have a history. I mean, Tunisia really does have a secular history and a history of respecting women's rights and a history of, you know, respecting women's equality. But they're getting, you know, a lot of these messengers are basically imported messages. And even in Egypt, you have this huge migrant population that's spent a considerable time in Saudi Arabia, and they're coming back with these very regressive messages on women. And so, you know, and the satellite media is also doing the same. Women don't have access to their national media or their satellite media. So you don't see women presented in these medias, and if they do, you don't see them presented through a progressive perspective. We're talking about progressive issues. Even if you have, you know, if you have women sometimes talking about women's issues, they're usually relegated just to talk about women's issues. Again, you bring one woman, tokenary woman, to talk about family law or something, so you don't see women in positions of power. And I spoke to a young Egyptian woman who said, we need to have women talking about everything. We need to have women talking about security issues, security reform, about women's issues, about politics, because our communities need to see women in positions of power, and until they do that, they're not going to elect women to power, because they just think that women are dealing with women's issues, so they need to see that. But unfortunately, women don't have access to media. And in countries like, you know, in our region, where you need to change the hearts and minds and the beliefs of people, you really need to have access to media. So you have this broad range, and you're presenting them with new ideas, or you're reinforcing ideas that they do have about the equality of women. And you can counter those regressive messages that they're getting. People talk about alternative media. Alternative media is great to bring up issues that maybe are sensitive, to sort of create discourse. but it's not enough to penetrate people's minds. It's not enough to, to change cultures and to change beliefs. And women really need to change beliefs. Women in those countries, women in, I'm not talking about, they need the opportunity to get their message out, to offer a different vision on women to the population, and they can't do it unless they have access to media. And this is in Tunisia. I had a meeting with the Association of Tunisian Democratic Women. This is before their elections. They had a program where they were going to assess the media coverage of their national media of women's issues and their inclusion of women. So women in this region are fully aware that media is an important tool. And their report, I think, is out. They're going to have a meeting this week to talk about their findings. So I'd be interested to see what those findings are. But this is around the time before the elections, during the elections, and after the elections. And their elections was in October 24th. So, and the last challenge facing women is conflict, increased conflict and militarism in the entire region. I think the whole region is facing the possibility of, it's already either embroiled in war, it's facing internal conflict, it's facing military rule, or or the possibility of extended more conflict. And I think the case of Iran, I'm Iranian, so I want to use this last bit of my talk to really talk a little bit about the case of Iran and the possibility of war, is yet another conflict that's being introduced in this region that is so utterly conflict-ridden, and in countries where you already have women sort of at the center of an ideology around which all the different parties are fighting about, and women are getting the brunt of this violence, then you introduce a whole new set of circumstances that are violent and deadly, with women again at the center of this. And I think that it's really it's an important issue to keep in mind and to look at. I think that in many other countries, in many other regions, when you have conflict, violence against women becomes a byproduct of that conflict. But in this region, it becomes the central focus of that conflict. So the impact on women is significant. And I have some recommendations. I'm just going to read through them because I think I don't need to really talk about the recommendations for the international community, just for people who are academics or observing this. It's important to have women speak for themselves. There are plenty of women in this region advocating for rights, but oftentimes they're not given the opportunities to come and speak for themselves and to talk about themselves and what their issues are. And I think that there is sort of the West certainly has a Orientalist approach to women from this region. I think I was at a talk at the UK, and there were two women alongside of me. They weren't really women's rights activists. One was involved in the revolutionary in Libya, and one was a human rights activist, and they didn't have much of a perspective. And the message that they kept giving was not necessarily a gendered perspective, but people kept dismissing me because I suppose I spoke with an American accent and didn't wear the veil. I felt, for the first time in my life, I felt like I should have the veil so that people would listen to me. But really, it's problematic because you get this whole this relativistic approach when it comes to women's rights in the region, and you don't just get it from governments, you get it from academia, you get it from human rights activists, and I keep wondering why. Why is it that when it comes to this region, it's okay that women have lesser rights? It's okay that they have half the rights. It's okay that intellectuals say that that's fine. I don't understand it. I don't understand why Westerners sort of give up their universal approach to human rights when it comes to our region. So I think it's important to have people with progressive messages on women's rights talking at the international level, and, in international conferences, dialogues, even opportunities like this. They're not, just because they're giving a message that's similar to what you believe in doesn't mean that they're not legitimate. They are legitimate. They are fighting, and they're fighting under extremely difficult circumstances. And providing support for their organizations and for their participation in international conferences, supporting efforts that help build solidarity between women's groups in the region, as you pointed out, so that this message can in fact be a message that's indigenous. So if I'm saying it from Iran and somebody else is saying it from Afghanistan and somebody's saying it from Saudi Arabia, and you have enough voices from this region being reflected that's talking about women's equality, then it becomes an indigenous issue. It's not a Western concept. And it helps us to sort of say, I'm saying this, you might accuse me of being Western, but somebody's saying it in Saudi Arabia, and somebody's saying it in Yemen, and somebody's saying it in Iraq, and we're all saying the same thing. So it's not un-Islamic, and it's not foreign to our culture. And I think it's important to remind governments and the international community again and again and again of the universality of rights and the obligations of these countries to live up to those rights. And I think as women's rights activists, as feminists, and human rights activists, we need to be vigilant about the developments that are happening in this region. We need to watch very closely, especially the process of constitution writing, of writing of laws. And when people talk and make very vague statements, we need to ask them to be specific. I'm not saying that anybody in the West should speak on behalf of anybody in those countries. I think that women from those countries should speak on behalf of themselves and people on the outside, on the West. And I wear multiple hats, so even myself on the outside from an international perspective, I need to support that. I don't claim to speak for anybody, but we need to support that, and we need to be vigilant about what's happening and see what women are saying in those countries and support that message and make sure that message gets out. And this is an extremely critical time because this is when the constitutions are being written. And they're going to be in place for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And they need to be laws that are defendable, that we can defend, not just them, but us as well, can defend against questions of a future generation that says, why did you count me as half that of my brother, the value of my brother? And we need to ensure that women's voices are heard in the media. Maybe we have little influence on national media, and international media, is important, but we need media that gets out to the public in that language. We can have influence on the BBC and the VOA. And, I was invited to Egypt to talk about women's developments in Egypt and bring the Iranian perspective. And I went on a very short notice because I thought it was very important. And when I got there, I was told that, we decided not to do this panel. We're just going to have men on the panel. And I said, why? They said, why put women on trial? It's as if, because it was supposed to be a question and answer session, why put women on trial when it's the men making the decisions? So let the men answer the questions and they'll be on trial. But what they did was they sort of took away the opportunity of women, a very important opportunity of women to address their public and to talk about their demands and to talk about their perspectives. They lost that opportunity. And so it was a Muslim Brotherhood person and a Salafist person who talked about women's rights, but they were very vague, and all the very specific questions were dismissed. So, and that was their panel, the BBC's panel, BBC Arabic's panel on women's rights in Egypt. And I think it's important also for us to oppose further conflict in the region. It's really critical. And I say that again as an Iranian, but also an American. I think enough is enough. No more war, really. And lastly, I just want to say that you can send your message of solidarity to women in Iran, because I think a lot of my colleagues in Iran are very concerned about war. They're very concerned about the sanctions, and they're writing statements and videotaping messages against the possibility of war. And I think that Americans can also take this opportunity, and you here can take this opportunity and send a message of solidarity against war and in solidarity with the women inside in Iran. And these are some of the action items what you can do. You can join a Facebook page that says no to sanctions and to war. You can take a look at the site of the 1 Million Signatures campaign, where some of the Iranian women's rights activists are going to post their videos about their fears with respect to war, and you can also do a video message, and I'll be happy to do that if you want to do that with me. I have a little camera, and there's some Iranian friends in the audience that are going to help me as well. If you want to send a message to Iranian women inside Iran, we'll be happy to videotape you and post it also on Facebook. And if you want to get information about the work that we're doing in the region, this is what I presented here. The paper was sort of a different version of an issue brief we did on the region about what's happening with women, women's perspectives on political developments in these countries. And this was a regional one, but the next one's going to be on Tunisia. And there are things happening in Tunisia all the time. There's going to be one on Iran and one on Libya that'll soon be released. And then we'll have some regional ones dealing with women in conflict, violence against women in the region, so looking at the regional trends. And that's the address for ICANN's site. So please do take a look and stay tuned for our future issues. Thank you.